Good morning. Shall we begin?
नाम बता दो इसको मेल करना है प्रेजेंटर तारिका प्रभाकर
Look, don't begin, just say something.
It's a fine morning.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We begin with day 2 of the international seminar. Professor Meenakshi Pava will chair this business session, Angarey, Poetry and Progressivism. Parallel sessions are being held in Geography room and Anthropology room.
Good morning, everyone, to all those who have joined us this morning online for this very first session of the second day of this international seminar. For this session, we will have 4 presenters: Tarika Prabhakar, Devashri Dattare, Diamond Oberoi Wahali, and Sohini Saha. Has Tarika joined?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm actually here and I just message that I'm here and I'm ready with the presentation anytime that we need to begin.
She's joined with a different name. So
Okay.
Yeah.
So, big warm welcome to all the presenters and all those present in the auditorium this morning. I would request Tarika Prabhakar to make her presentation entitled "The Ripples of Angarey's Rebirth and Afterlife, an investigation of Angarey's rediscovery." Tarika Prabhakar.
Hi, good morning to everyone. I just wanted to confirm that I'm easily audible and then I shall begin. Am I? Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, hi. Good morning. I'll just jump into the paper, I believe, straight away. My paper is about the publication of Angarey, the first publication in 1932 and the second one in 1995, and there have been subsequent publications as well. So historical study of the various publications and what perhaps questions arise out of these publications and the historical background which surround them. So this paper aims to discuss the publication history and background of the anthology Angarey, which was first published in 1932 by the Nizami Press in Lucknow and republished in 1995 by Educational Publishing House in Delhi in Urdu. A brief look at the historical moments which gave rise to the 2 versions of the book can provide important and interesting insights about how literature and popular consciousness intersect, often with dangerous consequences for the authors or editors who take on the responsibility of creating blueprints for symbolic as well as semantic rebellions for their readers. This was the stated ambition of the Angarey writers and the cause of the legal and social backlash that they had to suffer. I will begin with a brief history of the 2 publications, and the second part of the paper will offer some analysis of the 2 publication events and what insights one can gain through an exercise of such comparative analysis. In the 1930s, the self-avowed intention of the Angarey writers was to rebel against the forced and artificial alienation that became characteristic of the modernist project in Europe as well as in India. The 4 Angarey writers had access to upper middle class as well as Western education. The progressive movement exemplified the rallying cry for the role of literature to reach out to the common masses and be explicit about its political role in society. Through their personal narratives and interviews, the progressive writers have stated at various places that the collection, that is Angarey, gave rise to the collective, that is the 4 writers who came together to eventually propel the formation of the progressive writers movement rather than it being the other way around. The book's first publication coincided with the issuance of the General Communist Notification in September 1932. The book was published in December 1932. The notification banned several communist books in India, and the writers were decidedly influenced by communist ideology, but also attacked religious orthodoxy. And as a result, in February 1933, the Central Standing Committee of the All India Shia Conference demanded that the book be banned immediately by the British. The book was, of course, banned under Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code on 15th March 1933 by the government of the United Provinces for, and I quote here, a deliberate and malicious intent of outraging the religious feelings of any class of His Majesty's subject. As Devika Sethi in her work, War Over Words, Censorship in India 1930 to 1960 states, in colonial India, the state monitored and banned or prosecuted publications falling in three main categories. Those that transgressed norms of loyalty laid down by the state, and these were called seditious publications. Those that transgressed moral norms as interpreted by the state and pressure groups within the society, and these were called obscene publications. And finally, those that incited communal or social disharmony, and these were titled hate literature, or violence by members of one group against another. Although seditious and obscene are terms and categories frequently used in colonial discourse, their meaning was not fixed but subject to changes in time, place, and political circumstances. Angarey, as an anthology, fell precisely within the dynamic and fluid definitions of what came to be termed obscene and offensive throughout colonial discourse. As a practical result, Shingavi states in the introduction to his English translation of Angarey, which was published by Penguin in May 2014, all but 5 copies of the books were destroyed by the government. Out of the 5, 2 of the extant copies were sent to London, where they were held in British Library's Oriental and India Office collections. Shabana Mahmood, in her article Angarey and the Founding of the Progressive Writers Association, states that the British Museum obtained a copy on 21st June 1933. After this, the book was lost to the reading public for all intents and purposes, but even in its absence, the book cast an undying and influential shadow over Urdu literature, especially the tradition of the short story written after Angarey. In its brief life of about 4 months, the book was read by very few but judged and berated or celebrated by too many. This was also dictated by the number of readers who could access the book. It is interesting also to note that the first publication of Angarey comes on the heels of the Indian Press Act of 1931, which was to remain active as a framework for action against the press for the next 2 decades. This act strengthened the hold of the colonial government over the Indian press in the volatile environment of the increasingly intense national struggle. Consequently, 1930s was a very interesting time for the Indian press. At the beginning of that decade, the Hindu had already been around for 50 years, the Times of India for almost a century, and at the same time, according to the 1931 census, fewer than 10 out of every 100 readers Indians could read. In fact, colonial authorities termed this low level of literacy a very serious obstacle to obtaining full, sufficing nationhood on modern democratic lines. And I've taken this reference from Devika Sethi's earlier cited book. However, they also recognized that it was precisely this low level of literacy that accorded educated Indians disproportionate influence and gave rumor a peculiar kind of force in the Indian milieu. Was this perhaps the influence that the religious orthodoxy as well as the colonial government feared that the Angarey writers and their bold literary experiment might have on the ordinary reading public? There was certainly a lot of anxiety about the influence of literature and newspapers in the 1930s. Through an interview conducted for this paper, Dr. Khalid Alvi recalls the journey of trying to publish the scandalous book in 1995. The republication in Urdu was made possible through procuring a microfilm preserved in the India office in London. This event of archiving and inventorying of the knowledge systems of the colony to be produced, reproduced, and archived in the imperial centers, even when they defy the same imperial center, is in itself an important epistemological process that reveals how post-colonial knowledge of the self and the imperial centers is constituted. Indian sources, documents shored up in imperial centers away from the academic reach of most Indian scholars is another way in which the post-colony is reproduced within epistemological boundaries which they cannot define. Dr. Alvi suggested that procuring the film from London was done with some help from personal friends like a Swedish acquaintance and Dr. Kamal Rais. Dr. Alvi states in the interview that due to the furor it caused at the time of the first publication, the book was not accepted by any publishers when he tried to republish it in the 1980s. His account suggests that he began looking for a publisher since 1985 and found one willing to publish the book a decade later, only by 1995. Even when the book was published, it was possible to do so only after deleting some of the more scandalous and objectionable words from the book which had caused offense in 1933. The insinuation, for example, that the Prophet's wife was nagging, which drove him to move out of the home to make his iconic journey, is just one example of the editorial choice exercised by Dr. Alvi before the book could see the light of day in the last decade of the 20th century. This raises, of course, uncomfortable and ironic questions about the changed or unchanged nature of censorship and expectations from the reader, despite the passage of 60 years in between the two publications. The fear of literary freedom becoming submerged in religious and orthodox scandal, of truth being inverted beyond the control of the readers, writers, editors, which the Angarey writers were mounting a resistance against, had manifested itself in the late 1980s again, with the publication of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. According to Dr. Alvi, the literary fates of the two books, Satanic Verses and the republication of Angarey, were intertwined as the publishers were scared of hurting the religious sentiments of Muslim orthodoxy through the republication of the scandalous Angarey on the heels of the controversy stirred up by Satanic Verses in 1988. India gained the dubious distinction of being the first country in the world to ban the import of Satanic Verses. The book was published by Viking or the Penguin Group in London. The Indian counterpart was the Penguin Group, which decided not to bring out an Indian edition, and the consulting editor of the Penguin Group in India was Khushwant Singh, who advised against the publication of Satanic Verses in India, as he believed that it could offend the sensibilities of Indian Muslims. The only way left for the Indian reading public to at all gain access to Satanic Verses was through importing the UK edition, and since the Rajiv Gandhi government prohibited the import of the book under the Customs Act on September 26, 1988, a mere 9 days after its publication in Britain, this was also not possible. In an interesting parallel, in the interview, Dr. Alvi states that he approached Khushwant Singh to write a preface for the republication of Angarey as well. Khushwant Singh agreed and eventually wrote the preface for another of Dr. Alvi's books, a collection of essays, but refused blankly to be associated with Angarey on similar grounds that it was too blasphemous and would cause backlash from the Indian Muslim community of readers. This brings forth the debate about the role of censorship in promoting the ethics of anxiety, which collapses the distance between the semantic and symbolic function of literature, which fundamentally lends strength to literature's political radicalism. This radicalism was a stated intention of Angarey as well as Satanic Verses. Both were literary reactions to the semantic and imaginative limitations of different forms of fundamentalisms. Censorship, fundamentally, requires arresting the sign and denying even the possibility of the plurality of the interpretative process. The banned texts can entertain no multiplicity of interpretation, but must retain one fundamentally arrested semantic identity. Terry Eagleton, in a recent article in the New Left Review, states that, and I quote, "Fundamentalism is essentially a mistaken theory of language." Jonathan Bates adds to this that it assumes that every word of a text, whether sacred or secular, must be read as a sacrament or a statement of a literal truth or a proclamation of the unshakable beliefs of the author. And I continue, and I think this is the most important part. Fundamentalism is deaf to irony, metaphor, satire, allegory, provocation, ambiguity, or contrariness. The association of this anxiety of singular interpretation that became associated with Angarey's first publication carried on its burden till the 1990s, so that even though the actual content of the text was no more as scandalous, it still generated cultural and literary anxiety about literature transgressing the boundaries of social orthodoxies. Both of these instances of publication, of Angarey in 1932 in the backdrop of the nationalist movement and in 1995 in the backdrop of the publication of Satanic Verses, regurgitated the easy and reductive binary of the East and the West. Rushdie's Satanic Verses was seen not as a metaphoric representation of the migrant experience of a South Asian in the West, but as the misguided representation of the wayward South Asian attacking his traditional roots because of the corrupting influence of the West. In his article about satanic verses, Bruce King states, important works of literature and major writers often signal their presence by being the occasion of controversy, lawsuits, claims of obscenity or blasphemy. Madame Bovary, A Doll's House, Ghosts, Ulysses, Lolita, and Dr. Zhivago are interesting as literature using new concepts of form, style, narrative, and characterization while challenging the political, moral, or social standards of the time. Though through their own admission, the progressive writers were influenced by Western avant-garde writers as well. The blasphemous nature of both the satanic verses and Angarey was attributed to exposure to Western education and ideas. Priyamvada Gopal, in her book Literary Radicalism in India, Gender, Nation, and the Transition to Independence, states that since the Angarey writers had received Western education, they lent themselves easily to accusations of being, I quote, intoxicated by English education, brainwashed into attacking Islam and its tenets. In his book, translated The Light into English and Roshnai in Urdu, Sajjad Zahir talks about the lack of depth in the stories in Angarey, but also about the influence of writers like D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce and the way in which sexuality is treated in the anthology. This, he stated, was taken as an excuse to attack Angarey as being influenced by the West. Carlo Coppola, in the article, The Angarey Group, the enfant terrible of Urdu literature, quotes Ahmad Ali as stating that he never dreamed that there would be such a furor. People issued death threats and even waited for them with daggers. This brings to fore another unfortunate parallel between the satanic verses and Angarey, which can be used as a gateway to initiate discussions about the issues of the physical repercussions of censorship and the important debate about the freedom of press and literature even in the 20th and 21st century. The attempt on Rushdie's life in August 2022 in New York is just another instance of the blurring of the lines between literary expression and ideological execution. According to an article by Times of India, even on the heels of the publication of the book, The Satanic Verses, 12 people had lost their lives in what was dubbed as the anti-Rushdie riots in Bombay in February 1989. And of course, we all know what Rushdie was, what the recent attack on Rushdie cost him. The republication of Angarey also presents an interesting case of how meanings of censorship have been re-articulated through the century. There are many manners of censorship attached to the book. The banning of the book upon publication is, of course, the most obvious form of censorship, due to which the book was not available to the reading public for a very long time. But if one examines the definition of the term censorship more closely, another kind of censorship becomes very obvious. B.T. Muller, in Censorship and Cultural Regulation in the Modern Age, states that censorship occurs when there is authoritarian intervention by a third party in the act of sending a message between author and reader, after which the message cannot reach the public. The deletions made by the editor, Dr. Alvi, to make the book more accessible is a form of sanitization reflecting self-censorship. This comparative study helps us get away from the dialogic bifurcation of the imperial villainy and hegemony, as opposed to a nationalist and progressivist resistance, which was forwarded as a justification for condemning the banning of the book in 1933. How would the censorship of books like Satanic Verses or the self-censorship of the republished version of Angarey in 1995 be read in the absence of the villainous colonial laws? The impulse of censorship and its focus might change, but the fact of censorship defines both the instances of the publication of Angarey. The book's publication in Urdu in 1995 has been a commercial success, with the book running into multiple editions. Dr. Alvi believes it must be at least 10 editions since the first publication in 1995. The English translations, one by Rupa Publication and another by Penguin, both in 2014, have not received as much reader response, as the books have barely run into second editions, though of course exact publication numbers are almost impossible to get. At the time of the first publication of Angarey, the freedom of speech almost literally translated into freedom of dissent. The second birth of Angarey, the freedom of dissent, is already curtailed, as in the case of Satanic Verses, and the reaction of the Indian government to it. The freedom of speech hence becomes a conditional aspect of the political and social reality in the last decade of the 20th century. The change in the vocabulary between the two periods, proscription in the 1930s and forfeiture in the 1980s, can symbolize a change in the subjective position of the state, but the censorship remains. Censorship is often projected as a state's ideological.
Dr. Prabhakar, please wind up in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just at the very last paragraph. Censorship is often projected as a state's ideological and ethical responsibility towards its citizens. Ironically, this curtailing of literary freedom takes away the freedom of literary interpretation, forcing of a singular interpretation and intellectual engagement from the reader, and culminates most commonly in the curtailing of the freedom of the life of writers or editors like Rushdie since the publication of Satanic Verses. It begs the reader to extend the literary function of a text to its political function, which the Angarey writers originally aimed to do. And I stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Prabhakar, for a very incisive inquiry into the rebirth and afterlife of Angarey. I just want to put it across to presenters and to those present here that we will first take the papers and then subsequently the question and answers. So the second presenter for this morning is Dr. Debashree Ray, and her paper is entitled In the Rhythm of Sahir Ludhianvi, of Creative Resilience and Solidarities. Dr. Ray.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone there, everyone online and in person. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's good to hear the voices of old friends, Professor Pawa and others, even if we can't see each other right now. I would like to, I have a PowerPoint, if there is in a way that I could start.
Yes, share your screen.
Yeah. Perfect. Is this visible?
Yes, it's visible. Please make it in slideshow mode.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, because one of the things that I want to do that I'm glad.
If you could use slideshow mode, that would be better.
I did do that. Is
Just
it not
press
showing?
F5. Just press F5.
Okay. I did so. Isn't it showing?
No, not yet.
Wait. Is this showing now?
The screen is showing, but it's not in slideshow mode. Just press from beginning. Yes, just press that. Just
I
press.
did. Yeah.
No, just press this button. Yeah.
Okay, now?
It's not pressed. I mean, just press enter.
I did. It's showing. It's coming to at my end.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, I think it's okay. We'll go. Anyway, it's just a perfunctory slideshow and other things to say, so it's okay. Don't worry. All right. So what I'm looking at is the idea of language and the idea of polyvocality, and these are things that I would like to talk about when I'm looking into Ludhianvi in relation to the impact Ludhianvi has had in the world of literature, language, and others, and let us see where we go. I begin with a quotation, and I'm sure a lot of us over here would be familiar with this. शब्द शब्द होते क्या है जी, ध्वनि जिसमें वे अपने मतलब झुला देते हैं, जिनका कोई प्रमाण नहीं होता, अपनी राह निकल लेते हैं, मटके तन और मन के अवसाद से उपजे अपने मतलब का उलट मतलब पकड़ लेते हैं, बोया बीज खजूर का, खिला वह गुड़हल, अपने ही संग दंगल, अपने ही खेल में रंग. This is, of course, Gitanjali Shree's book, and we know what this is about. And this is probably the point of entry for me when we talk about our paper. Uh, and if you look at Sahir, and of course I have this quotation by Samir and Razamir, which says that Sahir's work does not allow the serious critic to wave it off, not simply because it's so popular, nor because it offers its own best defense through periodic references to its raised on their ethra, but because of the fact that Sahir pushed the boundaries of an explicitly political brand of poetry that served as an aesthetic experiment of the time. Uh, One of the things that I'm going to be concerned about today, and I speak over here as a comparativist, is that how does one create a space for thinking about language and politics within the ever-changing topos of the humanities? Perhaps it is important to address gaps in critical knowledge that challenge processes of marginalization. How to think of language politics that addresses linguistic and cultural differences. We are all aware of Ludhianvi's centenary, which was celebrated last year across the world. And one of the things that came across is this idea of centenaries itself. And this is, of course, something that one speaks about in relation to Manto. And centenaries can be useful occasions for reflection and understanding. In the case of someone as contentious as Siddhartha Manto, his 100th birth anniversary offers an occasion to not merely locate Manto in the continuum of the short story tradition in India, but also make amends. For instance, those who regard Manto as a writer of a certain sort of stories would do well to study this over in its entirety to understand its range and complexity. So what I'm interested in, as we celebrate anniversaries over here through this conference as well, is this idea of stock taking that one needs to do whenever one is thinking about anniversaries. And probably one of the most important things that one does when one is talking about the anniversaries to reflect on the possibility of a conversation in a situation where you have hardening differences, and also in a situation where conversation becomes one of the most reluctant methods of trying to engage with the other today. So I think in that context, this conference also gains tremendous importance and impact because of its insistence on that conversation. Insistence on thinking of an India that is open-eyed, eager to listen, and also open-hearted to an extent. An India that would be a curious India. So if you look at this, of course, this is Rakshanda Jali, who says this: a broad sampling of Manto's work will reveal a wide range of subjects, dark stories of the evil that lies hidden in the hearts of men, stories of exploitation, double standard, greed, corruption, and others. So again, what you're looking into is, as perhaps it's important to locate moments of dysfunction and irregularity that can help one renew engagement with traditional and emerging models of interpretation, particularly in the context of the textual and affective qualities of literature, film, television, and of course the digital moving image media. As a comparatist, one is tempted to insist on a linguistic polyvocality that registers the political economy of an art. I mean, look, these were lines from the Upanishad that felt important because one wants to look into this primordial aspect that Ludhianvi talks about. And I found these lines from the Upanishad very interesting over here, where it says, self-existing and all-pervading, the wise poet has dispensed objects through endless years. And it's almost like a spatial dimension where the text is out there, but it is for us to interpret and see where we can go from there. Reading Ludhianvi, of course, provides us this opportunity to look into an inconvenient mirror and the articulation of a sense of anger, which is very important in terms of, instead, of course, of a prosaic zuban. The idea of kalam as a raised fist is again something that I'm interested in. Uh, as we all know, since the late 2000s, streaming media from countries in both the global south and north have effectively ruptured linear patterns in, in the idea of the text itself. This could be film, this could be media distribution and consumption. So one of the questions that one needs to ask again and again is, how does the recentering of the global media sphere reconfigure and deconstruct the media space for us? And it brings us to questions of accessibility, which perhaps changes our readings of the relationship between the translator, the content provider, and creator within the context of a media landscape. And I speak of this because I'm talking about this humongous
Dr.
vast.
Dr.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your slides are not moving.
I haven't moved them as
Okay,
yet.
okay,
It's okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, we have to fathom the effects of COVID-19.
Sorry, again, there's a black screen in front, just maybe.
All right. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to share it again. Yeah. I think it's visible now.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I'm looking into this. Like I said, we have to fathom the effects of COVID-19, but streaming has been a consistent part of media consumption during the lockdown, and the sphere of the global media system will never be the same. And I think this is also where Ludhianvi needs to be located today, because we are looking into important questions that one must ask. Is that, how has streaming and translation perhaps impacted existing inequalities of access? And more importantly is, the previous speaker spoke about censorship, which I think was very relevant, is that the filtering of media for public consumption has aggravated the complicity perhaps to soft power or less disruptive notions of alterity within a globalized media. And this is where Sahil Ludhianvi's insistence to speak of anger, to speak in terms of the pen becomes important over here. If we look into these lines again from Ludhianvi, I think this would be clear. We have it on the screen. Here we go, stalking fire through song-laden lips. The fear of the world can never staunch the flow of our words. In all, we have just one view, our own. Why should we see the world through someone else's eyes? It is true we did not turn the world into a garden, but at least we lessened some thorns from the paths we traveled. Plurality as a theoretical concept is inherent in the practice of comparative literature. Comparative literature, which I feel is a practice, not an object, and a plurality that is not in flux, but necessitates interaction. And comparative literature's theory as aesthetics, as ethics, teaches us plurality in the world, plurality in the condition of our being, the strength of comparative literature that lies in the word comparative itself. We assume that there is more than one assumption of plurality in that space, which is what fits India very well. living with difference is not a choice, but a reality that pervades our everyday. And again, Ludhianvi over here, when he speaks about in the youth of my age, I'm not going to read from this poem because I think we are also a little short on time. Also, because I know this is known to a lot of people over there. And the other one, yeah. Both of these sections that I wanted to look at these poems because one's ability to engage despite the hardening of difference is most pronounced in a post-pandemic world. Our insistence is to fathom the difficulties of others, the ethics of the discipline, perhaps. And one is not talking about geopolitics, but is attempting to understand difference. And as a teacher in comparative literature in the humanities, one engages with a being in the world, a relation that must be articulated by my praxis and is clarified by a pedagogy. Ludhianvi or texts such as Angarey aid in that pedagogy because it's a pedagogy that insists on the rejection of the premise on which imposed categories are based, which are received categories, and which reek of undeniable essentialism that in turn reduce our shared realities. And this is where I look into other forms of resistance that has worked in different places. So for example, in April 2010, you had Latino students who chained themselves to the main doors of the Arizona state capitol in an act of civil disobedience to protest Arizona's SB 1070. And this was again something that happened, which led thousands of original contributions by poets and artists from around the globe. And this kind of global phenomenon, this idea of creating a media space that rejects notions of soft power, to reject notions of complacency in a way, is something that Ludhianvi also speaks about. And I think this is why I wanted to bring all of these together over here, because as you realize is that the basic premise of memory has been its relentless effort to resist often inaccurate and fabricated central narratives of control called history. So memory acts as a safeguard against attempts to silence voices of transgression and dissidence, and in turn, memory is often implicated in that silencing. So what one's trying to do is to recognize relations of unequal social power that are being constantly enacted at both micro and macro levels, and understand our own positions with these relations of unequal power. Think critically about knowledge and act on all of the above in the service of a more socially just society. If you remember, after Ludhianvi's death in 1980, the poet painter Bawari dotted Ludhiana with cloth banners that read Hai Sahir. Speaking of the old days and Ludhianvi's youth, Bawari agreed that chuck play was the poet's most evocative work. He raises the curtain of the hypocrisy in society, calls prostitutes by the names of the most revered women of the three religions of that time, and that too in a climate of communal turmoil. And that never will be a poet like him. I leave these lines of Chucky in front of you, and because one of the things that I want to talk about, and this is where I end, is that we now live in a world that compels us to challenge known categories of analysis, if only to better understand the inherent geographical and intellectual terrains in our own niche zones of comfort. And because that is there, I will end with lines which I'm sure, these lines give me goosebumps even when I look at them today. I'm reading from the translation over here right now, and I will end with that. It is said that on a dark night in the monsoon month of Ashar, a Sardar of Tughlaqs named Sayyid Masood Ghazi crossed the flooded Ganges and attacked Ghazipur. As a result, from Ghazipur, this town changed to Ghazipur. The roads remain the same, the alleys remain the same, the houses and the buildings remain the same. The name changed. The name might be something like an outer skin, it can be changed. Perhaps the name has no unbreakable bond with the person, because if there had been such a bond, then the town should have changed too when it became Gazipur from Gadipur. Or at least this much was expected, that the defeated Thakur, Brahman, Kais, Ahir, Bhar, and Chamar would say they belonged to Gadipur, and the victorious Sayyid, Sheikh, and Pathan would claim they were residents of Gazipur. We all know what happened thereafter, and I hope that this kind of conversation continues because that is what's important. Because these were lines from Adagao, Rahimahullah. Thank you very much for your attention.
He's a professor in comparative literature at Jalatpur University, Kolkata. The next speaker for this morning is Diamond Oberoi Vahali. He is an assistant professor at Ambedkar University, Delhi. And his paper that he presents this morning is entitled Film Lyrics and Sahir Ludhianvi. Dr. Vahali.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you for organizing this very exciting seminar. And I regret that I couldn't join it. My paper is about Sahir Ludhianvi's poems and film lyrics. And I'm going to be talking about a specific theme, that is the critique of nation states, borders and boundaries by Sahir in his poetry and film lyrics. And I will also be referring to other poets who were a part of the progressive writers movement. So I will begin by referring to a poem by Sahir titled Kuch Baatein, which as a part of Talkiyan was published around 1946. In this poem, by referring to the pre-independent India, Sahir talks about the tribulations of his nation under a foreign government which is oppressing his people. He proposes to talk of the hunger, poverty, and helplessness of his people, the calamities and the oppression that they are subjected to, the manner in which they are deliberately kept in ignorance, and ends by stating that one day this regime will finally collapse by the axe of the laborers. Right, Sahir, let us talk about the travails of the nation, talk about the foreign rule that is upon us. Instead of discussing the splendor of heaven, let us talk about this hell that we inherit. Ironically, soon after the independence of India, Sahir wrote a poem titled Arch, a poem that he had recited on the All India Radio on 11 September 1947, wherein instead of celebrating independence, which was long awaited, he, like Faiz Ahmed Faiz, mourns the cost at which India became free. Faiz, in his poem Ye Daag Daag Ujala, clearly states that this is not the dawn for which we had all sacrificed our lives. Writes Faiz, this stained, tainted light, this night-bitten dawn that we were waiting for, this is not that morning. Faiz ends by saying, yet the oppression of the darkness has not been elevated. The moment of salvation for our sights and hearts has not yet arrived. Keep marching, for that destination has not yet arrived. In the same manner, Sahir mourns in Arch and reflects that today he has nothing to offer to his people because all hopes have been completely shattered as there's nothing but bloodshed around. He appeals to the people to create a new India which will be full of freedom for everyone, so that the freedom for which they had all fought and finally won will now be truly realized. Ironically, though, in Kuch Baatein, Sahir had analyzed the state of India prior to its independence and had asserted that we are living in a living hell, but sadly the post-colonial reality of India did not turn out to be different for the people, and the poets still continue to mourn both the cost at which India attained freedom and then the subsequent falsification of this freedom, which actually betrayed the people who had given their lives to attain it. Therefore, the struggle for freedom in numerous ways continued even after 1947 and sadly continues even today. Sahir ends the poem stating, "Today the entire ambience is reduced to begging, and in this desperate environment, I, with my bag of compositions, roam about from pillar to post, give me back my lost melody." Similarly, in A Compromise, Mafabat, written on the Independence Day, 15th August 1947, instead of celebrating the independence of India, Sahir critiques it as he feels that the plundering of humans by the new nation state India is still continuing, even though the Britishers have left. Though the poem in particular, like Aaj, condemns the communal divide and massacres, it implicates the new Indian state, which nurtures the dark elements in humans and cultivates light from darkness. He very pertinently predicts that this flame nurtured on darkness will only poison this nation's soul. This celebration is not one of joy, but a circus. In the guise of something new, the attempt to plunder is afoot. After putting out the lights on communal harmony, this radiance is of those lanterns that have been nurtured in the dark. Such light that has been cultivated from the thews of darkness, if it spreads, shall only spark many a flame. And if it does not spread until the break of a new dawn, will poison this nation's soul. In 1955, with the release of Pyasa, Sahir emerged as a significant voice in the world of Hindustani film lyrics. The song Jine Naaz Hai Hind Par offers a blatant critique of India, which has completely failed its people. Written from the perspective of a witnessing consciousness that takes us very vividly through the lanes and by-lanes of a city, Sahir depicts the filth, poverty, and inhumanity existing in post-independent India. By focusing on the word Nilam Ghar, the auction houses of India, Sahir depicts the present reality as akin to that of the olden times when slavery abounded. He suggests that there is actually no difference between those so-called uncivilized times and the present independent India, which in actuality is still living in the dark ages of slavery, as it is harboring the wasting of human lives and existence. The refrain in the poem Jine Naaz Hai Hind Par, Wo Kahan Hai, implicates and mocks at the state and its governing agents and demands that these people who are proud of India must truly see where the inhabitants of India reside. They need to know the reality of the people who are living a living death. Using a highly metaphorical poetic language in the lines, Ye sadiyon se bekhab sehmi si galiyan, he metaphorically suggests that the humans, like these lanes for centuries, have been living lives which have been completely suppressed as they've constantly lived lives of humiliation and have been muted. The poem in the lines, Ye Dhal ke badan aur ye bemar chehre, elucidates Premchand's idea of beauty as delineated in his presidential address, The Aim of Literature, delivered to the first All India Progressive Writers Association conference, wherein Premchand stated that literary writers must write about the lives of the oppressed and create a new aesthetics of literature that will delineate both deprivation and resistance. In this context, both Jine Naaz Hai and Faiz Ahmed Faiz's Intizab very vividly contribute to the development of a new aesthetics in literature. In Intizab, writes Faiz, let me write of the mothers whose children sob in the night and cradled in tired, toiling arms will not tell their woes. Let me write of the little houses, the narrow lanes and courtyards, where the earth is so unclean, where the shadows are so deep. Sahir too de-glamorizes the feminine body, pertinently intervening in the aesthetics of Urdu poetry, which so far had mostly focused on the beauty and grace of the female form. Instead, Sahir depicts the inner experiential reality of women, and yet the song nowhere turns propagandist. On the contrary, the song is a great expression of poetry and operates on a symbolic plane. As the song culminates, it embodies the consciousness of an oppressed woman and calls for help. The refrain changes from "where are they who take pride" to vehemently reprimanding and demanding that these people who take pride must come and see the truth about the so-called free nation, which is in such a state. Ironically, the song highlights that those who say that they are proud of India are actually missing, as they have never seen the real India. Obliquely, the song suggests that this pride in India is only a pseudo pride. The reality is entirely different. The poet vividly testifies this truth to the nation as he reflects on the post-colonial reality. The song "Wo Subah Kabhi To Aayegi" in the film Phir Subah Hogi 1958, based on Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, is a song full of hope and offers a utopian conception of India. It proceeds by juxtaposing despair with hope and states that nature too will celebrate along with humans when the old exploitative society will come to an end and the new dawn of an egalitarian society will come into being. The song becomes a critique of independent India, where the value of humans is measured by money alone. Sahir criticizes the productive economic paradigms where everything has a value but humans, and where humans are measured by pennies. Sahir further defines the meaning of independence from the perspective of women when he writes, "Daulat ke liye jab aurat ki ismat ko na becha jayega, hat ko na kuchla jayega, gairat ko na becha jayega." These lines reiterate the theme of Jine Naaz Hai, but the connotation becomes even more dense, for here Sahir does not merely refer to women living in brothels like he did in Jine Naaz Hai, but also refers to the marriage market where almost all women are sold. The poet continues to criticize poverty, unemployment, extreme class disparity, and introduces new themes into his idea of an ideal India when he includes the crisis and dignity of all people and children. He goes on to talk about a new dawn when India will realize its real democratic potential, for when those protesting for their rights will not be punished. While inversely referring to his hopes and dreams for an ideal India, he analyzes the manner in which hopes of people are completely squashed and so gets into a state of interiority and depicts the experiential reality of the oppressed. The poem gives us a new vision of India, and India with the outer and inner life will be taken care of. He hopes that this country, or even the world, which is presently worse than hell, will one day become a paradise. And this will only happen when people will not be forced to live their lives according to the stringent retrogressive norms of society, and that they will not be punished and humiliated for living according to their will. Interestingly, Sahir offers a vision of India without prisons and punitive ways of reform. As the poem culminates, the refrain of the poem or the song changes from "Wo subah kabhi to aayegi" to "Wo subah hami se aayegi." The poem ends by giving a sense of complete agency to those who are humiliated and the oppressed by stating that we all have it in us to bring this change, and so let us bring it. The final stanza of the poem predicts and invokes the people who for centuries have been marginalized to rise fearlessly and overthrow the system of domination. Very poetically and metaphorically, Sahir ends by stating, "जब धरती करवट बदलेगी, जब कैद से कैदी छूटेंगे, जब पाप घरोंदे फूटेंगे, जब जुल्म के बंधन टूटेंगे, उस सुबह को हम ही लाएंगे, वो सुबह हम ही से आएगी, वो सुबह हम ही से आएगी." He emphasizes that the very earth is going to change its axis, and this world, which is full of evil, is going to erupt, and the reign of oppression is going to end. Once again, the song resonates both with Mazas Lucknowi's "Bol Ari O Dharti Bol" and Faize's "Hum Dekhenge," where Faiz states, "When the mountains of oppression and cruelty will float away like carded wool, we will see. Underneath our feet, we the governed, the ground will echo like a thumping heartbeat." The invocation to the earth to change its axis and to overthrow the system of oppression becomes the essence of all these poems, suggesting that the very elements of nature too are on the side of the oppressed and one day will return with vengeance to annihilate oppression. Mizaz Lucknowi writes in Bol Ari Udharti Bol, मंजिल अपने पाँव के नीचे मंजिल से अब दूर नहीं हम
Please
बोल
wind up.
अरी उधरती बोल राज सिंहासन डामाडोल.
Dr. Bahali, please wind up soon.
Okay. I had other songs also, but if I need to wind up, then I'll just come to the last part. Can I take another 2-3 minutes?
Yeah.
I'm skipping. There were some other songs. I'm skipping them.
Fine.
Yeah, you
Fine,
can
fine.
take 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm coming now to critique of nation states and borders. Just 1 minute. So the poem I'm talking about is 26 January, which is, so Sahir calls the leaders of India responsible for the pathetic plight of the people. And he writes, if the wealth of the nation has increased, why this growing poverty? Whatever happened to the path towards people's prosperity? Similarly, Ali Sadar Jafri in Ye Azad Kaun Azad Hua writes that we really do not know as to who got freedom and whose forehead was unsmeared, as the smear of sadness still is smeared on the forehead of my nation. Similarly, Makhdoom Mohammadi in Jang-e Azadi reiterates the same theme when he writes, what is that world which is a world where there is no freedom for all? What sort of an independence is that where there is no power for the worker? Sahir all along stood for the rights of the people, and through his poetry, he fought tooth and nail against the discriminating policies of the Indian nation. I'm again skipping a little bit. I'm just coming to his most stringent critique of nation states. And the poem that I'm referring to is E Sharif Insano, in which he clearly says that, whether we win a war or whether we lose a war, war is war and borders are borders, and these are the things which destroy human beings. And therefore he pleads to the nation and to the world at large that war is something that must be stopped. So there were a lot of poems that I was referring to, but I'm sorry, since there was less time, I couldn't complete my paper. I was talking about Sahir's, critique of nation states and borders in particular, and referring to poems by other poets who belong to the progressive writers movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bahali. It was a very extensively researched paper on how Sahir's lyrics have impacted. More on my comments later. We move on to the next paper. The last presenter of this session today is Sohini Saha, and she's a research scholar at the Department of Sociology at Jadavpur University. And her paper is entitled The Poetics and Politics of Love and Resistance in Faiz Ahmad Faiz's Poetry. Sohini Saha.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Thank you firstly to the organizers for allowing us to present online. I regret that I couldn't be there in person. So my paper is, as ma'am already said, the poetics and politics of love and resistance in Faiz Ahmad Faiz's poetry. The early 20th century, I think, marked a time of upheavals, not only in context of nationalist movement that was taking over at that point of time, but also the radical changes and reformations that were increasingly taking place in society. And it was becoming pertinent thereby to speak on issues that concern the society and thereby taking a radical stance in relation to that. So the progressive writers movement, we all know, began on such a note, which was also inspired by the publication of Angarey in 1933. And the All India Progressive Writers Association was formed at Lucknow which emphasized, I quote Sahni, where he says, which emphasized on breaking away from the tales of magic and romance and the highly stylized court poetry to take up themes of problems of hunger and poverty, social backwardness, political subjugation, and to become critical of rigid orthodoxy and blind adherence to tradition. Now, the emphasis thereby, as Ali Hussein Mir and Raza Mir argues, was on the actualities of life, and that was marked not only by anti-colonial sentiments but also anti-religious, making it move away from the conservative realm to becoming more progressive. So the art of poetry was also becoming people's art. And the Progressive Writers Association's manifesto also emphasized on this about saving art from the hands of the, I quote again, priestly, the academic, the decadent classes, and bring the arts into the closest touch with the people. Now, Amir Mufti argues how a distrust of the ghazal was already there before, even before the 20th century, and continued in the 20th century among the literary movements like PWA, this Progressive Writers Association, who were also committed to the social purposiveness of poetry. And in this context, Ali Hussein Mir and Raza Mir recall a Sahil Ludhianvi sher that says, "Fun jo nadar tak nahi pahuncha, apne meyar tak nahi pahuncha." The art that doesn't reach the poor has not achieved its potential. Now, this focus on people's art and the severing of ties with the traditional romantic poetry marked a transition not only in poetry but also among poets. One among them was Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Now, Faz's association with PWA and his subsequent turn towards writing on political and social issues made many people see this as a political turn in his poetry writing. Now, Faz Ahmed Faz also once in his foreword that was translated by Imdad Hussain also said, I quote Faz, an understanding of the struggle of human life and a participation in it according to one's capability is not only a prerequisite of life, it is also a prerequisite of art. So this transition of writing on issues pertaining to the socio-political issues and for the common masses was also marked by his popular nazam that we all know, Musse Pehli Si Mohabbat Mere Mehboob Na Maang. Now, it not only shifted its focus on more political issue of the underprivileged, but also a poem that necessarily brought a severe critique and a breaking away from the beloved to move towards the concern of the common masses. And the popular line that marked this transition in the nazam itself was, लौट जाती है उधर को भी नजर क्या कीजिए, अब भी दिलकश है तेरा हुस्न मगर क्या कीजिए, और भी दुख है जमाने में मोहब्बत के सिवा, राहतें और भी है वसल के राहत के सिवा. Now, this nazam, especially these lines above, embodies in itself the spirit of the progressive writers movement that seeks to foreground the major concern of the other dukhs or other sorrows outside the sorrow of love. While the classical Urdu ghazals have often focused on dukh and gum, or pain and sorrow, the dukh and gum were always in relation to the beloved or the person in love. So, progressive writers movement and Faz's Nazam brought a departure to understanding gum and dukh outside the context of love or ishq, to bring it in context of the everyday sorrows of common people. Now, another aspect of the ghazals were obviously the theme of hijr and wasl, or separation and union. And Faz, through the lines "Rahat-e aur bhi hai wasl ke rahat ke siwa," also makes a departure from this. So, thus, for Faz, there were other sorrows outside ishq, and there are other pleasures outside the pleasure of union. And this departure is also significant as it also engages in a critique of the forms of ghazals that was also reflected by several poets. So I quote from Ali Hussein Mir and Raza Mir's book, where they also mention ghazal अपनी जहनियत की वजह से जज्बाती लम्हों और अर्जी कैफियतों की तर्जुमानी बनकर रह जाती है. Because of this temperament, the ghazal remains a translation of emotional moments and transient conditions. So the ghazal itself was becoming somewhat unfit for the progressive poetry that was the demand of the time, and that is also reflected by Amir Mufti, who I quote Amir Mufti, the classical tradition of lyric poetry, and in particular the ghazal form, became the site of fierce contention as too decorative, subjective, impervious to nature and reality, incapable of the sober intellectual effort and didactic purpose called in for in the New World. It was therefore emphasized that the progressive poetry increasingly needs to focus on Game Dauran, or sorrow of the world, and detach itself from Game Jana, or the sorrow of the heart. Now, Ahmed Faraz, I come to Ahmed Faraz here because Ahmed Faraz's ghazal, Dil To Hai Nadan Jana, I read it as a lamentation of the separation between the Game Dauran and Game Jana. So although the ghazal initially appears to us as a lamentation of a failed promise of the beloved, the Mausam Hijran, or season of separation, this separation is not merely a separation from the beloved, literally, but also in ghazals, that he might no longer be able to write ghazals about the beloved or the Jana. Now this is expressed in the lines, अब तेरा जिक्र भी शाहिदी गजल में आए और से और हुए दर्द के उन्वान जाना. So this comes as a lamentation from Faraz, noting that now the beloved would hardly be coming up in the ghazals, since the topic of pain is itself changing now. So he won't be able to write on the pain of the heart, Game Jana, but would be writing on Game Dauran. Yet he also critically sees this separation as an innocent failure to understand how the separation cannot be a possibility when he says, हम भी क्या सादा थे हमने भी समझ रखा था गमे दौरान से जुदा है गमे जाना जाना. Now we come to reflect on this through Faz, Ahmed Faz once again. Although मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत in Naqshi Faryadi, Faz is taking a departure, making a departure from the beloved to write on the social political issues. In the same series, he also brings in Raqib Se. And Raqib Se although appears very similar to Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat in that it also moves away from the beloved and ends on the note of the feeling the pain of the underprivileged. Yet this feeling also, I argue, emerges from his pain from the beloved. Now, Raqib Se is firstly unique in making us think about Raqib, the rival in love. Now, the rival is in most cases is seen as a person who will be disliked or seen as a competitor. However, here Faz draws resemblances with the Raqib, showing how they both fell in love with the same person. For Faz, instead of the beloved, it is interesting, it is the Raqib who will understand him better and understand his feelings better. And this way of understanding the Raqib is, I think, different and distinct and breaks our prior understanding of it. And Raqib Se also breaks a conventional divide, I argue, between Game Dauran and Game Jana with the lines, हम पे मुस्तरका है एहसान गमे उल्फत के इतने एहसान के गिनवाऊं तो गिनवा न सकूं हमने इस इश्क में क्या खोया है क्या सीखा है जिस तेरे और को समझाऊं तो समझा न सकूं. So he speaks of this uncountable ehsan or death he has from the sorrows of love or game ulfat, the things he has lost and learned, which is almost inexplainable. He then elaborates on the things he has learned from the sorrows of love or game ulfat. And I again go back into the poem. आजीजी सीखी गरीबों की हिमायत सीखी यशो हिरमान के दुख दर्द के मानी सीखे जेर दस्तों को के मसाइब को समझना सीखा सर्द आहों के रुखे जार के मानी सीखे. So above all, he first mentions about learning azizi or humility that we understand or has also humbled him to understand the plight of the underprivileged. He then goes on to elaborate on about how he has learned about the agony and pain, about the hardship and suffering of the underprivileged, and the meaning behind their pale and discouraged faces. And this ways of understanding of the suffering, pain, and agony of the poor and the subordinates again emerges from his sorrow of love. Thus, the pain and separation, rejection makes him all understand and learn about the sorrows of the common masses. And then again comes to say, जब कभी बिकता है बाजार में मजदूर का गोश्त शाह राहों पे गरीबों का लहू बहता है आग सी सीने में रह रहे की उबलती है ना पूछ अपने दिल पर मुझे काबू ही नहीं रहता है. With this, Faz comes to this last two couplets, taking us into the grave socio-political realities of the time and the impact they have on him when he says, "Aag si seene mein reh reh ke ubalti hai na pooch." However, this way of feeling for the downtrodden is once again emerging in Faz from the deep sorrow of love that makes his heart also feel the pain of the downtrodden. So Raqib shows us how the love and longing for the beloved also teaches Faz the meanings of Azizi, to feel for the downtrodden and instill in him the spirit of revolution. This equation and merging of the sorrow of love and the sorrow of world is beautifully expressed here, I think, making us come back to Ahmad Faraz is saying that we were indeed innocent when we accepted that the Game Dauran was separate from Game Jana. Amir Mufti also discusses how Faz's poetic vocabulary, very interestingly, also drew from Persian and Arabic, classical Urdu ghazals, for example, Law Kalam or Dast Gulzar, which he reads as a resisting of the plain language that many of his contemporaries were using at that point of time. So I quote Amir Mufti, in this sense, Faz's poetry is a living rebuke to the ideal of a neutral Hindustani idiom from which the Arabo-Persian and Sanskritic influences has been excised, an ideal to which the secularist, the anti-communalist imagination in South Asia has been repeatedly drawn. In his later poems, especially Daste Sabah and Zindan Nama, we we come across poetry that fuses, as Shabina Parveen says, love and revolution together, where a beloved comes back into the poetry as both the person he loves and also the motherland. But I do not see it as a return of the beloved because I argue that the question of love has never faded from his work. Parveen thereby writes, thus love and romance, revolution and politics, patriotism and universal humanism emerges as a dominant theme, mingle, suffused with the individual style in the poetry of Faiz Ahmed Faiz. According to Ahsan ul Haq, Faiz's poetry is distinctive that he never expresses it in direct voice. He always that just like the usual poetries on resistances are, but Faiz instead uses metaphors for the same. And thus the Mehboob is both the beloved as well as the nation, and sometimes the idea of freedom that he desires. And this is how Samuel Haq says he transposes the personal ambition into the collective dream of the oppressed people, and thereby fuses or blends the poetics and the politics. Law Kalam is one such nazam, I would say, which is written and bringing in love and resistance together, which urges people to continue nurturing the feelings of one's heart in slate and pen. Now, here the question of heart is very interesting, an important query. How do we understand heart or dil? And does the heart only absorb and feel in love or mohabbat, and or does the heart also feel for the world, for the downtrodden? How do we distinguish between the two? So when Faiz writes, हम परवरिश लौह कलम करते रहेंगे, जो दिल पे गुजरती है रकम करते रहेंगे, he speaks of all that the heart is going through, whether it's the pain or sorrow of love or suffering, or suffering under a tyrannical rule. In a similar manner, the lines asbaए गमे इश्क बहम करते रहेंगे, वीरानी ये दौरान पे कर्म करते रहेंगे, speaks of both the sorrow of love as well as the desolated time, the game dauran. When he speaks of the tyranny or the ignorance he receives, it is unclear whether it is the ignorance or the tyranny of the beloved or the socio-political tyranny or ignorance. And the Nazams brings in both the themes of love and politics, such that a separation, I argue, between the two becomes impossible. So it's a poem of resistance, a resilience against all atrocities. And I argue that the urge to keep writing when the heart goes, what the heart goes through, is itself an act of politics to show the struggle and the remembrance. So I argue also that love itself also becomes political when we consider love in context of the same-sex relation or intercaste, interreligious marriages in our times. In such context, Game Doran cannot be separated from Game Jana when the beloved is separated because of the socio-political conditions. The theme of separation has dominated most poetry, even in Faiz. I also read the separation of Hijr in itself as political. Hijr is not only about separation in love, but also about longing. And according to Shelza Rai, Fraz brings in hijra in a political sense also with the concept of hijrat or migration in context of partition. And therefore he says the current motive I quote her, the current motive of hijr in Faz encompasses both the inevitability and melancholy attached with displacement. So, being a partition poet and writing extensively on partition, his gum or sorrow reflects the notion which intermingled with the notion of migration when one is separated from their place of the beloved or the nation or the country. And thus, when Faiz writes about the separation in love, it is both the separation as well as the displacement, separation from the beloved as well as the nation through partition. So thus, this paper has argued that Faz's supposed political turn is not a turn. It might not be a turn. That is a departure from classical Urdu poetry, and neither a fresh entry into the political, since his poetics, that is the lyric and the metaphorical ways of writing, and politics, love and resistance, Game Doran and Game Jana, cannot be separated in the strict sense. Also, I argue that the element of unrequited love that one longs or desires for is also similar to an unreachable justice or freedom that one desires and works towards in hope and longing. And the act of writing of this unrequited love or the unfulfilled desires of what one holds dear, whatever, whether it's love, freedom, or justice, itself then becomes a political act. And thus I say that the ghazals and nazams are poetic and political all along, as it documents the struggle, the perseverance, and the hope of people in love in love with what they hold dear to. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohini, for keeping to the time. And very quickly, I will share my comments on the four presenters. I know we are running short of time because we also have some questions. Anybody who has questions? Yes, you can come up and then I will sum up the session.
I would just like to add something to what the first presenter had argued. I mean, Tarika, if she's there, and I'm sure she's there online. In fact, it's very interesting to see, and I'm happy that this paper addressed the question of censorship laws in connection to Angarey. And it is interesting that Angarey, in fact, is imbricated in a number of an entire set of offenses. It's not just one kind of offense to propriety that Angarey would have led to, but it was multiple forms of propriety that Angarey had offended. At one level, as she argued, it was an offense to religious propriety and orthodoxy. Then there was another kind of sexual offense to sexual propriety as well. And then again, a certain kind of a nationalist offense to moral propriety as well. So one thing that, is often less argued in connection to Angarey is this question of, how the nationalist elite received Angarey. So the reception of Angarey by the nationalist elite is something which is less discussed, because we often talk about, the reception of Angarey by the, Muslim Orthodox, readers and critics and so on. So this question, I think if she can just reflect on that, it would be very nice. And this entire question of sexual explicitness being targeted in and against the Angarey writers also brings to mind another debate from the early 20th century on the publication of Radhika Santvanam, when Bangalore Nagaratnama wanted to publish this erotic epic by Muthupalani, who was an 18th century courtesan. So that also led to a similar kind of a furor and outrage. So this is another parallel incident that comes to mind, around roughly the same time. So if she could just talk about, these.
Tarika, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much for the question. I wanted to look at the nationalist project and how they perceived Angarey as well. But that kind of comparative, because my paper was predicated on a comparative analysis of when Angarey was first published, and then it was when it was republished in 1995. So in that sense, the definition of nationalism gets sort of stretched out very, very thin, because nationalism means something completely different in the 1980s and 1990s when it was republished. And of course, there's a whole lot that can be said about the nationalism or the definition of nationalism at the time when Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister, and in the era of liberalization and so on and so forth. But those kinds of definitions sort of complicate the basic argument that I was trying to make. And the second thing is that indirectly, I believe that I have addressed some of these questions because of the way in which my argument was predicated on the reading public, which is why I gave the census numbers also. There were very, very few people who had actually read Angarey. And so the access of Angarey as a text for the educated elite was basically what created its perception and its reception, and played a very important role in how it was understood and later on projected. So that is one thing. I believe that I had at least made some reference to it. And similarly, when comparing it with what had happened with Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie in the 1980s, a lot of the responses that were received, a lot of the responses that were formulated after what happened to Salman Rushdie in 1980s was also an academic reaction to it. And there has been a lot more academic reaction, academic analysis, intellectual regurgitation about the about the influence and the consequences of the publication of satanic verses and the debate about censorship. And again, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to connect it with what happened to Rushdie in last August. The attack on Rushdie is also a continuation of the same debate as to where the lines dividing nationalism, where the lines dividing academic freedom of press, freedom of literary expression, and freedom of religious interpretation within these kinds of larger debates where they sort of reside. I hear your question, but I think it was slightly beyond the scope of what I could have done within 15-20 minutes within this paper.
Thank you, Tarika. And I agree, but you have responded well. And that also was a pertinent query because, in fact, that was more or less what I had kind of thought in my mind as well. Anybody else who has a question in the audience? Or any of the presenters of the papers this morning? Okay, though I had made some copious comments, but I think I'll quickly sum up. And you see, Tarika Prabhakar's paper obviously brought in a comparative melding together of how Angarey resonates even today. How whatever the issue of censorship, whether it was to do with morality, public or private, or sexual issues that were brought up in that question, are resonating even, and in fact, when she talks about the afterlife, is the republication of the text. And how, with the republication of the text, the same issues came up when we talk about the satanic verses that she has brought about. And she takes a very, very comprehensive overview of the bold literary experiment that was done during that time with the publication of Angarey for the Indian public, and very much talked about. And she very beautifully melded together the post-colonial angle, that kind of how the post-colony reproduced from it the epistemological boundaries. And also, she talked about the trajectories and the transgressing of the social boundaries that were attributed or are attributed to exposure to Western education of the writers, the four writers of Angarey. Definitely the meaning of censorship is relevant. Even now, we know that how things are perceived in the world of today, the present dispensation, what the freedom of speech is now being understood as. Any dissent is seen as the anti-state. These are the things that we as scholars, as academics, need to investigate, need to question. So the whole idea of the change of vocabulary was very well brought out in her paper. In Dr. Debashri Datta Ray's paper, I think I forgot to give the introduction of Tarika. So let me make amends because we were running late and there were some technical glitches. So if my memory is not playing tricks, I omitted her introduction. So Tarika Prabhakar is an assistant professor at the Department of English at Satyavati Evening College, University of Delhi. Sorry, Tarika, for that pop-up. I hope I have made amends. Interestingly, Dr. Datta Ray spoke about Sahir's, how he pushed the boundaries of the political poetry, and also about the mapping out of the language use of in politics. She too brought about the issues of censorship and how in her own pedagogy, the plurality as a theoretical concept is very much evident in comparative literature, which is there in praxis as well. And she very lucidly spoke about how Ludhianvi rejected the received categories. Dattare also looked into other forms of resistance and how the notion of power was rejected in Ludhianvi's school, as it has very perceptible resonances of Angarey, offering multitudinous encounters and experiences and traversing and intersecting memory in different contexts. In Dr. Diamond's paper, she focused on Sahib Ludhianvi's lyrics and began with Kuch Baatein and also brought in a comparison with Aaj that he recited on the AIR and Faiz Ahmad Faiz's Aaj Ka Ujala. You see, this is my personal observation that I want to share, that last evening, you remember those who were present for Mr. Salim Arif's presentation. He mentioned that at one point of time that how most of these progressive writers, and he mentioned Ludhianvi also, had more power for lyrics in his films, songs, than he was publishing otherwise as a poet. The point was that they were all very, very intelligent and sensitive beings, because the power of cinema to a largely illiterate audience at the time that India got independence was not to be discounted, and particularly with the AIR as well. And so, though not within the purview of this paper, but has a linkage and a very relevant linkage, when people critique about Ismat Chughai's plays not being there in absolute form, lacking in the kind of quality of dramaturgy, my own critique is that these were the progressive writers who were not bothered about the form, about the aesthetics of their dramaturgy. The whole idea and obsession was to reach out. And that is why to reach out to as much. And with the advent of AIR, so this kind of triggered that memory strain, and I thought I must make that quick digression, that AIR became a very potent tool to communicate, just as cinema was, because our literacy was very, very poor. But while we talk about low literacy rates, which was brought out in Dr. Dattare's paper, we cannot discount the native intelligence of Indians. That's why those very subtle nuances that were brought out in Soni Saha's paper about how metaphors were melded into the lyrics of these progressive poets was so very well understood by the general populace. So coming back to Dr. Diamond's paper, rather than singing hosannas as was the wont, as all hopes had hit their worst nadir, her paper also talked about how the post-colonial India demolished that hope further by plundering, and she quoted about how plundering by the new nation state still continues. And that kind of shared his angst as well. And then she quoted extensively Jinhe Naaz Hai Hind Pe Wo Log Kahan Hai from the film Pyasa. And you know how it was deeply internalized by all Indians, because it was a highly metaphorical poet song, and extremely nuanced comparison between Faiz and also she brought out Wo Subha Kabhi To Aayegi, which kind of talked about the utopian image of India, despite the poverty, despite the unemployment that the country had. And again, why it is important, because what he was talking then is resonating even now, the high degree of unemployment that the youth is struggling with and the general angst of the youth in the country. And Sohini's paper critiqued the idea of nation state, and where she began with Air Sharif Insano, Sorry, no, I'm sorry. This is not Sohini's paper, it's just overlapping. And she also talked about the anti-war cry, which again is still relevant, which again takes us back to Lysistrata and how whether it is a comedy or whether it is a pertinent point to be raised where women rallied around to deny their husbands their sexual rights, to make them think that war is dangerous because they are the biggest sufferers. So her paper delved into the poetics and politics of love and resistance. That's Sohini. And the art does not reach the poor, and the art that has not reached the poor has not reached its mission, which meant that these progressive writers and poets did not make art or their poetry a highfalutin exercise. It was not esoteric, which I just touched upon, and I will not repeat myself for want of time. And she also talked about the transition from love to political issues, focusing on the very spirit of the PWM. And her paper also showcased his artistic departures in his oeuvre, and Sohini very well contextualized Fairs' poetry in relation to other poets. And how Fairs, she touched upon how Fairs gives us lessons on humility. I think a quality and a virtue that can never go out of fashion. And to sum it up, she, in the latter part of her paper, talked about the great social political realities of the times, and again, how extensively the metaphors were used, how love was used as a political metaphor of separation and displacement, and a kind of a leitmotif and very recurrent and inseparable in his poetry, both political and love poetry. So thank you all for being here for this session this morning. And I thank all the presenters for excellent papers this morning. Can we have a good round of applause for all four presenters? Thank you all for being very good audience this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pava. Thank you.
All those who have joined for the next session will be logging out and logging in again at 11:45. So what, 10 minutes? 15 minutes. Okay, so then.
There's an in-house announcement. There is tea in pavilion for everyone. Please join us for tea. Thank
So
you.
we rejoin at 11:55 or 11.
And the next session will begin at 11:45. Thank you.
11:55.
And please be here in the auditorium 5 minutes before.
11:55. We will have to be the 10 minutes.